If it's okay, what we've primed them, although it was only about a minute's notice, I seem to remember, so that was probably my fault, was just to ask, you've heard Kat's top tips, but you may want to add one more, Kat. What Bill and Glyn and Kat's one major top tip would be, well, you can have a couple of bullet points in that, obviously, to us as public sector and other partners to really embrace and embed long-term thinking. What would that top tip be? I'm going to start with Glyn.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to two very respected panellists on futures. I'm not a futurist. And in fact, there's a minister who one of her favourite comments to me is, Glyn, you're very good at telling me about the past, but you don't tell me very much about what I need to know about the future. And being chief statistician, I guess that's my job. But we do some futures work in Welsh Government, and I was part of the team responsible for the Future Trends report for Wales. And so I will get to a top tip, but reflecting on today, I'm actually really enthused that I feel the debate seems to have moved on a bit. When we launched the Future Trends Wales report 2 years ago, I felt there was an expectation that it would be something more, that people in Welsh Government would sit in Cathays Park and be able to predict the future, which we always knew we couldn't do, and I think we were never planning to do. I think the debate moved on now, 2 years on, to having practitioners around the table discussing how we can do scenario planning, how we can think about narratives and not sit there producing a bunch of trends, and I thought, Kat, you covered that really well. So I'm really enthused by today. I really think we're in a good place. So I think my top tip would be that in thinking about the Act and how we need to work in an integrated way, this seems a topic that we can do together, and that in building on the network that Rhidian over there has started to develop, we should do this as a collective. We should think about the scenarios as a collective, because we're all aiming for the 7 wellbeing goals as one public service. How can we do this together? And there's no point us all separately doing things. And there's some really great work going on in Gwent Futures, Public Health Wales, and the work we're doing. And let's bring all that together, have more power, and have better outcomes as a result of it.
Thank you, Glyn. I'll give Kat a rest for a minute, shall we, and ask Bill.
I'm just delighted to see so many people who are coming to start developing a futures practice. Having been in this field and looking at the rate of change we live with, I find it quite alarming that most managers in the public or private sector don't, in fact, have any organised and disciplined way of thinking about the future. That really is quite a worrying situation. I was at a conference called Transformations. It's a biannual series earlier last year, and the keynote speaker said, if we're going to reach the 1.5 degree target that will keep humankind in a safe space on the Earth, everything is going to have to change. And if we don't reach that target, everything is definitely going to change. So I think my first thing is just that recognition that has brought, I think you all here, that we're all in the transformation business now. And that therefore we absolutely must, as a matter of duty, develop the capacity not only to do all the usual strategic planning, which is sort of keeping going what we've got, but develop this capacity that Kat outlined to really think about the different future and to bring about the transformative response that is going to be required of us. And within that, I think where she ended, that this is a natural human capacity that we're mobilizing. The leadership needs to come from the top, because it's at the top that you can bring about the major change. But what we need to do, particularly for our next generation, is recognize that hope in the future is a natural and human capacity from which life flows. So the good news is that this doesn't have to be hard, it's hard work, but it flows with the natural growth that we all have and that our young people so desperately need. So I'm just delighted to be part of it with you. Thank you.
Ooh, how exciting. I do actually have some more top tips, and I would never call myself a futurist either, like an emergent strategic planner, perhaps at a push. But I was always fascinated in government how there was no lack of insight about the future. What there is a lack of ability to do something about it, which is what really floats my boat. But that kind of is why my top tip is don't think yourself necessarily as future practitioners or doers necessarily, as commissioners and users of foresight work. And so you don't need to know the guts necessarily or the detail of how to do all those different tools and techniques, blah, blah, blah. What you do need to do is know how to commission and use them effectively. And I think that is a slightly different set of skills. And the final point I'd say, sorry, my penultimate point is that, you know, the tool tail often wags the purpose dog, if that makes sense. Like, tools and techniques are of secondary importance to the purpose of what you're trying to do. So getting into that and starting from there and then designing the process, I think, is really important. Finally, networks of doing this is really important, and developing the language so you know what I mean when I'm talking about official future or alternative scenarios. It just becomes so much easier to work collaboratively then.
Thanks very much. Very wise words. So it's everybody else in the room's time. Everyone's brings experience of the hard work and the enjoyment as well of doing this in challenging but also opportunistic times. So comments, questions, thoughts of the panel, or just want to add in your contribution. Can I ask if you pop your hand up and just say who you are and where you hang out? That would be really helpful. Good old Malcolm. We didn't plant it. This is Malcolm.
Sorry, I'm Malcolm Ward. Thank you. Malcolm Ward. I work in policy and research in Public Health Wales. I've been thinking through the day, and it's something you touched on briefly, Tracy, is actually the past. And it does occur to me, and this might sound heretic, but it seems to me that actually you can't do good foresight without being informed by hindsight. And I just wonder what the panel will think about this. And I'm thinking particularly, I mean, the big end of the scale is climate change. We actually knew climate change was happening because we looked at patterns previously and recognized there was a break in those patterns. I also wonder whether or not people would have recognized that vinyl is never going to go out of fashion.
Now you're telling your age, Malcolm.
There's a very simple tip for that, which is look back as far as you want to look forward. And a critical sort of skill is tuning in to the sort of patterns that produced the current situation and see what sort of time period do they work over. Is it something that's going with the pace of technology every 5 or 10 years, or is it something generational that attitudes will only shift when the next generation come into positions of power? So absolutely do that. And I always, as a discipline, when I'm looking forward, do that look back to look forward and say, okay, I wouldn't have known back in 1970 what 2020 was going to look like, but what might I reasonably have thought I should know about then? And what would that give, what sort of things should I be looking for now? So definitely, you want to tune in to the patterns of change that you're working with and the time horizons over which they're working. The project I was in recently, when I thought we were working on forest restoration, and I said, when did this pattern start? And people said, basically when agriculture started. So I said, are we going to get it fixed in 20 years? Probably not. It's going to take a little while.
I'm going to agree with that. There's a slide in Ridian's slide deck, which I'm going to refer to for the workshops earlier, and many of you didn't make our workshop, so I'll repeat it here, which is something that our chief economist dug out last year from a Wales Office white paper called Wales, the Way Ahead. And it starts off by saying Wales is entering an era of unprecedented socio and economical change driven by increasing automation in industry. And we find that quite amusing because it's something you could write today. So I think learning from the past and those changes, I would agree, is a pretty good place to start.
Thank you. Oh, you can't all be asleep out there.
Hiya, I'm Louisa. I'm from Public Health Wales as well. I think I'm just interested, Kat, that you talked about how people talk about Wales and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act on a kind of international platform. I'd just be really interested to hear yours and the other panelists' reflections on what are other people's perceptions of what Wales is doing on futures currently. Like, how are we talked about? And now that you've kind of had some experience of working within Wales, or have you been surprised by anything, or is there anything that you kind of expected to find that you haven't? I'd just be interested to know how, you know, there's a difference between your kind of experience of futures in Wales versus how we're being talked about, and whether we're matching some of the international expectations put on us by the Act.
So let's point out why you're so special. I mean, I think it's the legislation that is really quite unique. And if you look at similar institutions, what you basically see is that they fall into two. They either have an advisory function and so they survive, or they have more teeth and they don't. They don't survive the pendulum swing of political transitions from different political parties. And that's, for example, Hungary, Israel, the list goes on. So what's really interesting, what people will keep an eye on, is the legislative lock, basically, that you've got here. And that is the real power. And that's where you're in uncharted territory, is how you decide to take that forward as citizens and as businesses. That's probably one thing that I'd say that I'm a little surprised about. I thought that there was going to be more civil society. I think they have been taking it up, but perhaps the conversations are a little atomized. Having a broader set of conversations across all those actors, like a genuinely ecosystemic approach, I think would be very, very valuable indeed. And also showing how, you know, at the end of the day, this lands in your community. And that's when, you know, health, environment, housing, social services, they're just things that matter to government delivery or public service delivery. They don't, like, those categories don't really matter to citizens themselves. So the key question is, how do we genuinely then use futures to make have a conversation about the future and how public services need to change in a way that makes sense to communities and individuals themselves. And that is, I think, what I would encourage you to continue to do. I know that wasn't the question you asked, but I thought I'd get that in anyway.
Can I just add to that? So I was at a meeting this morning around health and housing, and yesterday afternoon with the police, the whole conversation was about health, not healthcare, not the NHS. So environment, health, housing. Well, in the future, the majority of impact on health could be in the housing environment. You know, the environment in itself is key. So it's we do sectorize, which creates the boundaries, and it is really about how do we blend through the enabling technologies and the intelligence and the relationships, which I think are actually very unique in Wales, and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act helps that, is actually how we create the glue together, that we exploit what we bring together, and actually what we are custodians of, because none of it's ours, so that we can really help shift that future for us. In relation to the international world, so we work very closely with the World Health Organization, particularly WHO Euro region, and they are very keen for Wales to be one of 4 influencer countries across the Eurozone. And of course, we're pushing that for obvious reasons at the moment, because it is different and it is unique. And obviously, because we're just so fab at the Six Nations, I had to get that in as well. Apologies to any non-Welsh person in the room, because we're very special at that as well. Just stirring it up. A bit of provocation at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But they recognise that there is something different that's happening. And it's quite interesting when you have conversations with different ministers about an investment in one sector or gone through one department or a spend, which we're trying to shift to the word investment, will realise an investment in another, and that's about good government. And when we're talking about futures, this isn't about how do we invest from the government department on communities and housing, or housing organisations or local authorities of today. That's not what the world is about. It's about what does society look like, what does communities look like, how do we exploit it. It isn't about where does the budget come from. You can sort that out later. It really is about stepping into that world. And other countries see Wales as being a leader of that. But we kind of have to do it. But there's some really great innovation that's happening. And I think the other challenge is 5-year government tenures. That's what creates a lot of challenges in countries, because actually, you know, the politicians understandably want to prove what they've achieved in 5 years, and when you're starting to talk about 2030, the nifty way is trying to demonstrate what they're going to get in that 5 years along that journey, but build the confidence to own that journey in the first place. Is there anything you wanted to add on the... Was that a hand? Oh, there's flurries happening now.
Sorry,
Okay.
I forgot to say also the fact that Wales as a nation is doing a voluntary national report to the SDGs is very noticed. So big thumbs up on doing that, and that's setting a great example to the rest of the world. I think the trends work that you've done is also really interesting, the trends report. I think there's something interesting picking up on your political point. The National Intelligence Council get their trends report out in the interim between the election of the president and the inauguration of the next president. And I think there's something interesting about dividing part of the role of futures, which is the first step, the scoping and the ordering, looking at what the future looks like, and saying that that can be an apolitical process. And then a bit how Claire Craig said, then the implication stage where you're using normative judgments, that's where the political qualities come in. So trying to kind of be very clear about what you're recommending from a neutral perspective versus what's the kind of, and hopefully then each political party can take that on. And that's what Finland does. They get their trends report out, and each political party manifesto is developing policies within the set of possible futures for Finland that report outlines. So they're all pushing in the same direction. Sorry, apologies.
My name is Stephen McGowan. I didn't put my hand up earlier on, Kat, because I run a program called envision.wales. You can find it there. And it's about helping make your vision happen by joining strategy at board level with executive team tactics in order to get the results that achieve those goals. What I see when I do digital technology work with our public service boards is that you have up to 20 different organizations, and actually it's the police very often who are most interested, who are trying to do digital technology things to the same population, many of whom are their own staff, all at the same time. Do you have any insights that would help us not trip up over each other and produce something that is more coherent and can leverage one on another in order to move more at pace and at scale than we currently do?
So that's a really good question. I think a big challenge for us here. So I would say the Act gives us the architecture to try and do that, through public service boards and other regional working, where possible, we can bring organisations together to offer coherent services to citizens, including on things like digital offer. You then got police, which of course is a non-devolved body, so you do have that interaction between non-devolved and devolved public services as well, and where their leadership is through Whitehall. So I think there are some interesting questions in there. But certainly, you know, I work quite closely with the Chief Digital Officer, and certainly she would you know, we all want to see better integrated transformational digital services that work across organisational boundaries and work together where we can.
So, hi, I'm Chris. I work for Cardiff and Vale Health Board. I do strategy and planning and stuff like that. Strategy deployment, I like that term. So I'll ask one of the heretical questions then, I guess. It builds on the point you're making just then, Tracy, about we've been talking a lot today about this is about the future, but it's actually about what we're doing now and decisions now. And sometimes it does come back to money and budgets and the way we give out money in increasingly smaller and defined pots, and the way we do that now rather than thinking about that long term. But also that really good storytelling about our budgets. So the bit you never hear in we're doing loads of work with Canterbury at the moment. The partnership's fantastic, learning loads. But the bit you won't read in any of the reports is that Canterbury are £100 million in the red, and the government have tried to sack their chief exec 3 times in the last year. So it's a bit about, yes, we want to be at that future, and yes, we want good decision making. But if I go with my Cardiff and Vale and submit an IM, what we have to submit in Wales is an integrated medium-term plan, a 3-year plan, maybe not a long-term plan to Welsh Government, and that says I want an extra £100 million And I want that to invest heavily in the private sector rehabilitation, which is what they do in Canterbury. So they work really closely with private sector and getting people out of hospital quickly by getting them to do their rehab. But actually, that's really good because it creates jobs in the private sector, it creates circular economy, those sort of things. I'm not sure I'm going to get the response I want from government if I say that Cardiff and Vale Health Board needs an extra £100 million, and I couldn't put that in my plan. So there is a question about, yes, talk to them about all the evidence in the future and all the work that Canterbury are doing that shows changing the model now, investing in community, investing in the private sector works, but you have to hold your nerve and tell a really good story around it. I guess my other comment is just because I'm a bit of a theory nerd, is that what I've been hearing today just chimes a lot with what I've been reading a lot recently about complexity theory and about dialogue-based theories. And actually, in those theories, the skills that you need and the work that we need in the future and the way that organizations will work in the future is around, I talked about this earlier, about relationship skills, about sense-making, and about being able to develop networks and being able to communicate really effectively. But that isn't necessarily the training and the development skills that we put in our staff at the moment. I'm interested in your reflections on that.
And there are a lot of things in there. One just really simple thing just popped up for me in that one of my colleagues is Rafael Ramirez, who teaches foresight and scenario planning at Oxford. And he always gives a very clear steer to people that in any futures project, and I'm just thinking about the futures work itself rather than the money you might spend on a program, take 1/3 of your budget to do the actual futures work and 2/3 spend on communications. You heard Claire commenting earlier that the sort of work that has a big impact on the people who go through it, who then arrive at a much deeper understanding of why they would do something, the sort of commitment that you've talked about developing, if we really do this, it'll really change the world. But the people who haven't gone through it don't reach the same point, and they're not going to reach it just by being presented with a report. So I think part of what is the issue that you're talking of is that people need to arrive at that decision through a journey that involves them personally. And once you've got your material, it's a bit like talking about Finland. You have to take people through that journey and find some way, as you build that network of advocates, that you're building up people who have built that up for themselves and then bring their own sphere of action and influence into it. So you talked about complexity. Many people are now realizing that we need sort of a model of what we call network leadership, which is you progressively build out the network of agents, recruiting and enrolling pieces of the system progressively until you get to some point where you can then mobilize the resources out of the existing system. So I think it's really investing systematically in that process of building up the momentum for change and allocating the resource to that. That's part of the answer to your question.
Great questions and comments, thank you. I'm going to interpret your first question around buy-in from senior leads to be able to give you the resources to do what you want to do. And I think there's two answers to that. One is think very carefully about your allies. And foresight work actually often drives value for money, and you'll see that a lot of big infrastructure companies and a lot of big infrastructure projects do foresight, and they're very clear about the scenarios that they've developed. And why do you think they do that? It's because they're reassuring their investors. So actually, if you care about value for money, this is a sensible thing to do. So think about the kind of angles, and in addition, who are the allies, and realize that you're often not the best person to persuade your ally. If it's a minister, another minister is much better to do that. So think about how, what's the case study? It's like a testimonial from another minister in another country will actually be much more powerful than any number of graphs in front of your minister very often. The other answer to the impact question is around scoping, and I find that a big challenge with these kind of pieces of work is that you go all in. It's like, right, we're going to do a big foresight piece of work, and we're going to disappear for the next 12 months, and then we're going to use huge amounts of time and energy and come up with a bloody obvious, which is like, oh, population's going to go down, or like whatever. But in fact, what we need to do is we need to kind of be really clear about what's the scope? Where can you actually have impact? And let's have little bites at the cherry. So like over-deliver on a small scope that will really help and deliver value and buy you political cover, and then start pushing the boundaries, whether that's time horizon or the scope of the issue. So thinking a bit tactically is very useful. In terms of teaching complexity thinking, my instinct is that quite a few people think naturally like that. I certainly see that because when people go into the public service, they're so shocked by the fact that it's so siloed. Or like people are like, what do you mean the UK government hasn't done plan Bs for what's going to happen in Brexit, et cetera, et cetera. They think naturally in quite a complex, systemic way. And I think there's a lot in the human spirit that we can harness, especially if we do it from a young age, like Teach the Future. Peter Bishop is trying to put this all into the kind of primary and secondary school syllabus. But I also think, National School of Government, the Singaporean Civil Service College, they run excellent courses on this. I don't think it's rocket science, and I think it can feel like quite a big thing, but go and visit, schools that do this practically, and then you'll see what that looks like in practice. And I think it's pretty feasible and not that way out, too.
Just to mention that I think Hearts and Minds, and in terms of the Act, has been something that we've been trying to build up over the past 3 years anyway, and it's a cliche, but it has been a journey in terms of the Act, and we're all learning together. In terms of Future Trends Wales, the team went out and did a session last week with the NHS directors to try and start doing that, and I think heard today that very little awareness of what was going on in terms of future trends in that session. So hopefully we'll start to do that. And I think starting to get people to understand the thinking that's needed. And there's push from other sides in terms of a mandate for spend and so on. In last year's budget, I think we sort of did a definition of what we meant by a prevention budget for the first time. So we're building up, I think, in terms of time, but definitely in terms of future trends, Hearts and Minds, that's something we're very mindful of.
Thank you. And I mentioned a housing meeting earlier, so not for tweeting, but there's an underspend around integrated care fund that is money in Wales that goes through local authorities, colleagues, regional partnership boards around investment for mainly built environments. And the conversation went along the lines of the NHS isn't really around the table for it. And we talked about housing, and we said that it's very variable across the country. That actually it's about the narrative. It isn't about which fund comes from where. It's in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, from a national perspective, but also, more importantly, almost a local perspective, engaging with the communities. What does really good housing look like? How do we keep people as independently living as possible? Which is, I noticed the Canterbury model is around that. But people involved in the shared conversation, it's the kind of who knew when you do that actually there's funding from a different source that's available, that if you share the assets, actually something magical can happen. But we only think of the routes that come through our domain. And it's about liberating, getting rid of the boundaries, getting rid of the silos, because actually there's quite a lot in the system that we're not exploiting to the common good that will invest in a healthier future. Time for one final question. I think did I see someone's hand up over there? Kathy, the star. Oh, hey.
Now I'm even more embarrassed, thank you. My question was mostly for Bill and for Kat, but Glyn, I'd be quite interested in your response to this as well. So I've been thinking throughout today about the ways we do futures thinking and foresight work. So not just what we do, but how we do it. And I'm interested in on your your global travels, because I know both of you are very, very globally connected, whether there is anything happening in terms of how work happens. So I suppose I was thinking that if someone had said to me 10 years ago, would we be still having big conferences like this as the main way that we share expertise? I think probably conferences haven't changed that much in possibly the last generation, in terms of getting people around tables. It was fantastic having Henk sort of beamed in earlier. That was brilliant. That was real progress. But it sort of feels like we're just behind the curve on using technology to connect ourselves. So I just wondered, it's a bit of an unfair question, because I think I know what the answer may well be. Is there any other ways of connecting together and working together? Because I think today's been absolutely brilliant, and I've been talking to people all day, and everyone seems to really welcome this sort of event, but we can't have these very often to connect people together. So I suppose just your thoughts on, what are the other opportunities?
it is a sort of contact sport. I live in West Wales. As I tell people, most of my neighbours are sheep. I live on hillside there. So I'm highly motivated to find ways to do this work remotely. I've invested in a thing that big, a Microsoft Surface Studio, which enables me to do visual facilitation online. And we found we can do that with about up to 10 or a dozen people. You can convene futures work online. But that needs to be in the setting of the thick interaction, as we call it, of being co-located and face-to-face. Human communication is very much an embodied thing. And to get the real deep work done, there is no substitute for that. But I think we can't possibly afford to just keep flying everybody around all the time, all over the world. So I think we can progressively enhance the capacity to do it online, and the technology is all moving in the right direction. It's actually one of the areas I've worked on in my professional career for a good many years, and we're still a long way from what we need, but it is all heading gradually that way. The biggest problem is that you can't see which way people are looking, if you want to get really technical about it. We're very sophisticated in handling the initiative between us in conversations, and you just lose that the moment you go into a Zoom room.
Thank you. 4 thoughts. The power of WhatsApp for actually keeping people together is really ridiculous, very powerful, better than any other form of network. So up to 30 people actually works really well. Perhaps, why not in the design phase of a project in your organization, bring a counterpart in to help you do some brainstorming, like a 1.5-hour session. That kind of peer support, especially at the design stage and the integrating stage, I think is very important. Using artifacts to communicate very quickly, 2-minute videos or physical objects to help people understand and bring to life a scenario. That helps you get a lot of people at scale, develop an understanding of the insights from the scenarios without having to take them through it. And we also, the big thing that I've seen, and this is because of the work with the UN, the big opportunity is something that we call lean and agile foresight. So what is it that we do? Like, how can we use this when there's language issues, because you're doing it in a village in the middle of Botswana, or you're doing it in a humanitarian camp and you can't get access to resources, or you're doing it like the Danish. They've got something called the Pandora's Cell, when you're when your resource is not people or money, but time. Pandora's Cell is a foresight technique that you can use in civil contingencies. So literally, just as you're under pressure, you've got 12 hours to think about whether the submarine is actually from Russia, has got malevolent intent, or whether it's actually just broken down, making sure that in a civil contingency, high-pressured environment, that you're still thinking about the long term, 15 years out. So there are very interesting innovations. But like with most things around technology, and this is picking up on the question that Steve said, which is that the problem is that people always think, oh, technology is a really big driver. Oh, the answer to that is digital. Digital is a capability. Digital is not going to solve the fact that technology is potentially going to make us incredibly unequal, and that there's masses of health implications of that, or family implications of that. Do you know what I mean? Digital is not the solution. So I think in the future and in this space, the relational is always going to be important. And then thinking about how to speed some of this stuff up using digital and these amazing new techniques is really good. But I am very crap at using them because they always fall apart.
I just think it's a good question, and I think we need to make it as easy as possible for people to have these conversations and thinking time that we all know public authorities find it difficult to make that time, and if we can make it as easy as possible, I think we'll have a better chance of getting this traction.
Thank you, Glyn. So look, that's brought us to the end of this panel session. Please don't leave the room, because we want to see what your multiple choice questions were like, and then we mark you all, obviously. But can you just join me in saying a really big thank you to Glyn, Bill and Kat? So thank you all.